Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The era in which we ask nicely is over. Those are the words of the Culture Secretary, Matt Hancock, talking about getting tough on the big social media firms. He says the days of the Wild West online are over and he's got new plans, which he's announcing today. He's with me now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What exactly are you going to do in legislation to tackle these problems?
Well, I think clearly we need to make sure that we have a legislative framework to make it safer to be online. And I think that there's a strong support for that, both here at home and also domestically. So the plans we're putting forward today...
Here at home and domestically?
Here at home and internationally,
right.
Sorry. Thank you for clearing that one up. The plans that we're putting in place today include looking at the code of conduct in terms of how people behave online, making sure that those are enforced properly. At the moment, the big social media companies have got terms of reference, but often they're not enforced properly. Making sure that there's better transparency about what happens online. And also, in particular, I'm very worried about about age verification, about the fact children can go online.
Yes.
They can just tick a box saying, I am 13.
I did ask what you're going to do. So let's talk about fines. You've talked about fines. What level of fines against the likes of Facebook and Google?
Well, in the data protection bill, which is hopefully going to become law this week, then the level of fine can be up to 4% of global turnover. So in the case of some of the biggest of these internet giants, that's over £1 billion. Now, the plan...
You're going to fine Facebook, Google, Twitter more than £1 billion if they flout these laws that you're going to create?
Well, I'm saying that, yes, in the bill that's in front of Parliament right now, that's the maximum level of fine.
That's the maximum you could do. OK, you mentioned age verification. Children are supposed to be 13 to sign up to most of these platforms. Let's talk about what it would take for you to impose that fine. How many British children would have to be under the age of 13 on those sorts of platforms for you to slap a fine on Facebook and the other tech giants, Twitter, Google, whoever? Well,
I want to get to a point where all reasonable steps have been taken so that...
Of course you do, but how many?
Well, at the moment, there are millions of children on the platform.
Yes.
We just don't know how many...
No, but what's the threshold? You must have thought about this because you've come out today saying, I've got a plan, I'm going to take on the online giants. Is it 30 kids? Is it 100 kids? Is it 100,000 kids? Let's get some figures.
Well, I'm not going to give a figure because we're going to consult on it. What I want...
Because you don't know.
Well, the announcement we've made today is that we will legislate and that we'll bring forward a white paper later this year with more of the details, but we want this to be a conversation that the nation is involved in.
From Ofcom, you don't need a consultation on this, that half of 11 and 12-year-olds have a social media account. So I ask you again, how many children would it take to be wrongly on these platforms under the age of 13 for you to slap a fine on these companies?
Well, ultimately, I hope that we get to a position where everybody has to have their age verified, otherwise they're not allowed on. There's no point in having a rule to say...
I can't seem to get an age yet, but let me put something else to you.
You can get an age...
Hang on a minute. Your colleague Ben Wallace, who's obviously briefed with security, he has spoken about terrorist material being online. How long would terrorist material have to be online on a video sharing website for there to be a fine put on that site?
Well, hardly any time at all. And I'll tell you, some of the technology now can allow terrorist material to be taken off within seconds of it going up.
Okay,
so I think we should be very ambitious.
So have you got a 10-minute rule?
The Germans have brought in a rule that it's after a couple of hours.
Right.
The challenge is, if you bring in a rule with a set timescale, that the social media platforms work up to that timescale. I'd rather that they did it as quickly as possible.
Yes. But you are trying to tell them that you're going to put fines on them, so they need to know the rules.
That's right.
So you haven't got a time frame, or we haven't got what will happen in terms of how many kids need to be the wrong age to be on those social media platforms. Your team said you recently invited 14 of these companies to come and meet with you to talk about this, and I'm sure a range of other issues. How many of them turned up?
4.
4. Why so few out of 14?
Because I think one of the problems we've had recently, and having been in this area of work politically for the last almost 2 years, one of the problems that we've got is that we engage with Facebook and Google and Twitter, and they get all of the press and they get all of the complaints in the public debate. But there's now actually a far greater number of social media platforms like Musical.ly and others that they
didn't show up to your meeting.
They didn't show up, and the companies, they've now got over 1 million on their site.
OK, but it doesn't really inspire confidence, does it, that you're coming here saying, we're going to consult, we're going to have new laws, and you can't even, as the Culture Secretary, pull rank enough to get all 14 of the companies you've invited to come and meet you. On top of that, we can't get Mark Zuckerberg, it seems, as a country, to come and answer questions and be held to account by our MPs. He'll go and talk to senators in America, he'll go and talk to the European Parliament, but he won't come here. We don't have this kind of power.
Well, I very much agree with you, and that's one of the reasons that we're legislating. The fact that only 4 companies turned up when I invited the 14 biggest in, it gave me a big impetus to drive this proposal to legislate through. Before then, and until now, there has been this argument, work with the companies, you know, do it on a voluntary basis. They'll do more that way because the lawyers won't be involved, they'll be doing best efforts. And after all, these companies were set up to make the world a better place. The fact that there are now companies that have social media platforms with over 1 million people on them,
and you don't want to leave them to self-police.
Exactly.
Sorry,
and
let me
hold
put
on,
this to you
but
then.
there's an important point here, which is that having a level playing field is important. There's no other area of life in the UK where we say, because these companies are international, therefore we can't legislate.
OK, well, companies that aren't international and are online, and you are somebody who's stressing the importance of online and being safe online, this week you announced that the amount that people can bet in fixed odd betting terminals in those gambling shops all over the high streets will be capped at £2. I presume you can announce that there's going to be a maximum stake for online gambling.
Yes, there's a whole series of extra support for people who bet online and tightening of the rules online.
But there's no capping?
No, and there's tightening of the rules.
Tightening of the rules or a capping?
The rules are dedicated at protecting people online, and it's slightly different online, and the reason is this, that when you're betting online, the company knows who you are, and they can make sure that when they detect behaviour that is the behaviour of problem gamblers, then they shut down the account. The problem with the machines in the high street is that they didn't know who the people were because they're just standalone machines.
But the companies have no incentive to do that. They want to take their money. We're in a situation... Sorry, do you actually think it's acceptable that someone can max out their credit card and one bet online? You seem to have ignored the internet with your big announcement this week.
On the contrary.
It's an analogue announcement, is it not, in a digital world?
Did you read all 78 pages of the report?
Thoroughly. Go on.
Because then you would have read the many, many pages, dozens of pages, which are all about tackling the online problems as well. So I agree, the headline and the announcement that most people noticed was reducing the cap from £100 to £2 every 20 seconds that you can spend on these machines. But most of the document is about tackling the problems online, and there it is harder.
But you're still not introducing a cap.
Yes, we are introducing, through the Gambling Commission, tighter rules on problem gambling
that's
online.
That's not a cap, but I do have to, while you're here, as a member of the Cabinet, I have to turn to Brexit. Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, said this week that reading some of the UK's position papers, it sounds like we're a country that's trying to get into the European Union, not leave. What does that say about the way the government is handling itself in these negotiations?
It says that Michel Barnier is on the other side of the negotiation, and it's his job to try to make his position as strong as possible. So he says all sorts of things like that.
But they're not accepting our approach for a compromise, and the government cannot agree, even within its own cabinet, of the way that we should approach things like the customs union. Time is against. It's a farce, isn't it?
No, Michel Barnier has, throughout this process, of course, made his argument for his side of the negotiation. It's one of the reasons why this thing's been so noisy, is that the Europeans, both Mr. Barnier and others, have made arguments throughout about how weak they think the UK position is. It's their job to do that. Our job...
Are you not helping them by not being able to agree?
No, on the contrary, our job is to get the best possible deal, and we had exactly this noise ahead of the December Council, and then we got a good deal. We had exactly this noise ahead of the February Council, and we got a good deal. And so the nature of a negotiation is that some of it happens by megaphone, and we need to just make sure that we focus on getting our position right.
You've brought up noise and debate. The person who chairs those debates is the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow. Were you there when he allegedly called Andrea Leadsom, your cabinet colleague, a stupid woman this week?
I wasn't, no.
OK, well, in his statement, the Speaker's office, in response to that, said Wednesday was an unusual and controversial day in how business was handled in the House. Differing views were expressed on all sides of the subject. Strikingly, he didn't deny it. Therefore, should he lose his position?
Well, if he said what has been claimed, then what I'd say is that people should debate in a rational and reasonable way, and that sort of language is completely unacceptable. It is, you know, part of making politics a better way of doing things is about having more respect between men and women, more respect between people of different backgrounds.
So from what you're saying there, he should lose his position if he said it?
Well, I haven't seen confirmation that that's what he said, but what I think is that that sort of language is completely unacceptable in our political debate. Well, that's a matter for him, whether he denies it or not.
Yeah, but
I don't know whether it was recorded.
If it's the case, should he lose his position,
well, look,
Hancock?
that's a conditional question. We don't know whether he said it. What I think, though...
Would you accept it in your team?
No.
So he should lose his position, is what you're saying?
I think that I don't think anybody in my team would talk like that, because they're all very professional people.
Matt Hancock, thank you very much.
Now, politics has taken a back seat for the last 24 hours as we've enjoyed, or depending on your point of view, endured wall-to-wall wedding coverage. But before I talk to my panel, here's a reminder of some of the stories that have been making the political news this week. In a reminder of what political deadlock looks like at its worst, this was a week where frictions came to the fore. The 70th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel was a cause of celebration for some, a catastrophe for others. Violence flared along the Gaza border after the White House broke with international consensus and moved its embassy to Jerusalem. Here in London, there were clashes outside Downing Street as Theresa May welcomed Turkish President Erdogan for a 3-day state visit. The UK government might have wanted to talk up trade after Brexit, but Turkey's human rights record and its airstrikes on Kurdish fighters in Syria were difficult to ignore. On Brexit, it was a constitutional collision course after Holyrood voted to withhold its consent for the EU withdrawal bill. Jeremy Corbyn chose to highlight divisions within the cabinet.
When the Prime Minister wrote at the weekend that she wanted as little friction as possible, was she talking about EU trade or the next cabinet meeting?
Despite confusion within Labour over the single market.
We are ruling nothing off the table. We are concerned about the EA as an option.
Foreign Secretary, have you lost the fight in Cabinet over the customs union?
In an eventual coup for Theresa May, ministers signed off on a so-called backstop that would see the UK stick to UK tariffs after 2020 if there's no deal on their preferred customs arrangements. Elsewhere in Westminster, there were further reports of friction between the Speaker and the Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom. John Bercow, it was claimed, had called her a stupid woman, claims his office did not deny. And for the government, the locomotives of privatisation ground to a halt, with the announcement that the East Coast Line would once again be nationalised. Well, we're joined now by the Digital and Culture Minister, Margot James. Thanks for coming in. Let's pick up on the story at the end of our little film there about the East Coast Main Line. This is the 3rd time it's been taken back into government hands, but the government says they will return it to the private sector. The Transport Secretary says he's learned from this experience. If the government really has, why try for a 4th time to privatise that line?
Well, I mean, there's clearly been problems with that franchise and with the companies running it. And obviously the government has taken the decision to, you know, pull it back to get it sorted. But, you know, I think we wouldn't want to see it remain in government hands. The rail service is denationalised in terms of the train operating companies.
Every time it has been in government hands, it's run pretty well. I get that train a lot. I always seem to be absolutely fine. Privatisation's failed 3 times. You're not putting ideology ahead of practicality if you insist on it being in private hands.
No, I don't think so. I think that the important thing is to get it right. I mean, I'm more used to travelling up the west side of the country to my constituency, and it's a very good service. And you've got choice, genuine choice, between 2 companies for what sort of journey you want to make. And I think I'd like to see that replicated across the rail.
Very expensive, though, weren't they? I mean, train fares are astonishingly high when you want to travel a long distance. If the government were to run one of these franchises, they could take charge of that, could they not?
Well, rail fares are obviously the issue. How much do you want it taxpayer supported? How much paid by the users? How much profit is acceptable for operating companies to make? And what must you demand of them in return for allowing them to make that profit? So, you know, it's a complex sort of web of things. Certainly up the west side, you do have a choice between Chiltern and Virgin, and there are price differences.
If you want to get to Glasgow, you don't. You're forced to pay those prices. And it does seem to be quite popular, actually, the idea of taking the whole rail network back into public hands.
Well, it might be popular among people who don't remember how it was when it was all nationalised. And if people have got complaints now, I think they would find them many-fold if we were to return the whole system to a nationalised service.
It's just when we look at some of the outsourcing that goes on, I mean, the other thing that came up is Carillion.
Yes.
Failed company. Yeah. Commons Committee delivered an absolutely withering verdict on that, saying that its collapse exposed systemic flaws in corporate Britain and showed that the regulators were absolutely toothless. When you look at that alongside what's happened with the East Coast Rail Line, does it not make you wonder about these privatised projects? Well,
those two are very different. I mean, there is no excuse for how the board of Carillion have behaved.
Well, they've both failed. That's what they've got in common.
Yes, I do take your point. I think that for every Carillion, though, there are a myriad of providers doing a great job delivering public services. Because, I mean, government don't have a monopoly of knowledge as to how best to deliver public services. So although what happened at Carillion is inexcusable, I mean, it's not the only example, is it? I mean, it fortunately is the exception rather than the rule, but it is nonetheless unacceptable. But you get these things, I'm afraid, when you have services managed by the public sector as well. You've only got to remember the tragedy of the healthcare delivered at Stafford Stafford Hospital, and how long that went on under public ownership. I've got an example in my constituency of a school that's been allowed for far too long under local authority control not to deliver. So, you know,
and government is keen to intervene in some of these things, aren't you? When you see that business isn't operating properly. And there's been an announcement this morning that you're going to intervene more with social media companies to try and get them to stay within a code of conduct you would like to see. Explain to us how you're going to try and force them to do that.
Well, I mean, we've been working with social media platforms and internet companies for a very long time. And there has been some progress in terms of terrorist content and child abuse content that is dealt with far more swiftly than it used to be. Indeed, terrorism content is almost taken down now by the big platforms like Google before it goes up. But they have not made the same progress in other areas of completely unacceptable abuse, intimidation, bullying online. And you know, despite a lot of efforts, there is still, the internet is there's far too much of this stuff.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that, but what can you do to stop it?
Well, I was just coming to that. I mean, basically, we have developed a voluntary code of conduct, which, you know, has, as I said, it's borne some fruit, but not enough. And we've come to the conclusion that we do need it to be reinforced with legislation, and that's the decision we've come to. And so we will announce legislation at the end of the year to really speed up this process of improvement, which is long overdue.
Stay with us if you will, because I know our panel want to ask you a few questions about this. When it comes to intervening with social media companies, is it something you think the government will effectively be able to do, Paul?
Well, I think it should try. I actually do think it should try. But these social media companies are not social media companies. They are giant data companies dealing in the artificial intelligence of the future, dealing in data manipulation, needing a social contract with us, civil society, to even deploy some of the technology they're inventing. So we need to get the whole relationship between them and civil society and the state which regulates them on a completely different footing, I would say. So I welcome the idea of regulating the content, but really, who can hold in the world, let alone in this country, who can hold now a referendum or an election without the danger that a California-based company can allow Russia, China, anybody to manipulate our democracy? That's the real problem I'd like to see ministers and indeed the whole political class address.
Margaret James?
Well, I very much agree with what Paul has said. And I think what we've got to arrive at is a state where what is illegal and unacceptable offline is also illegal and unacceptable online. And that's a mantra, but we've got to make it a reality. We can only do that, in our view, by exerting the law in the areas not just of abuse that I mentioned, but also, as Paul mentions, political manipulation as well.
Are you worried about that if we do,
yes,
the next time
definitely.
we have an election here, if we have another referendum, that it could be manipulated online?
I am worried about it. I think that importantly, we've just about completing the passage of the data protection legislation through Parliament, and that will go a long way to guarantee people's data privacy and will reduce the potential for this sort of manipulation. But, I mean, it's something we've got to be ever vigilant about, for sure.
Is this somewhere that the government should be intervening, Anna?
Absolutely not. The idea that you've gone so quickly from talking about preventing videos of child abuse or terrorist content to what was talked about is bad behaviour online and policing content. The idea that democracy is hampered by something like Cambridge Analytica, or that people are swayed online by political advertising, is a kind of anti-democrat's wet dream. It absolutely is not true, and it's not happening. I think what we're getting in danger of now is saying that there is a right thing and a wrong thing to say online. It's an attack on freedom of speech online. Nobody likes trolls, nobody likes abuse, nobody likes people being nasty. But when you get into the state intervening to what people can and can't post online, can say online, can talk about online, especially when it comes to politics, that's an absolute, that's an invitation to censorship. Anyone with a kind of free bone in their body would, I think, absolutely balk at that.
Margaret James?
Well, we certainly want to respect free speech. I mean, that's an absolute given, that's a baseline. But political advertising and commentary is regulated when it's broadcast by the BBC, when it's appearing in newspapers, it's regulated, and we're not proposing anything more than that. What we don't think is right is that we have this very uneven playing field where things in the political world or in other worlds are permitted online that are not permitted offline. So we're not trying to attack free speech. We're trying to apply the principles of free speech to the online environment as they are applied offline. That's as simple as that.
Lucy, we get announcements from the government about social media companies quite often. This is different from when they're complaining about taking down terrorist content. But is it something the public are worried about and want to see the government take action over it?
I think absolutely. We live our lives more and more online, and I think there are two distinct issues today that the government are talking about. One is data and how you police that, particularly around political content, and the other is around harassment and bullying. I think, of course, there need to be safeguards to protect free speech, but I think people do want to see more done, and it's really one of the great challenges of our time, both how you tax and how you regulate these transnational tech companies that just maraud over borders. And Margot, I just sort of wonder, while the intent seems to me a good thing, how you really think it's going to be possible to enforce it. I was really struck today in an interview with Matt Hancock in the Sunday Times, the Culture Secretary, him saying that he invited 14 tech companies into the department to come and talk to him and consult with the government, and only 4 bothered to turn up.
Yes, very arrogant. That's absolutely true. And I think it underlines the decision we've taken that legislation is going to have to back up whatever we agree to do to reduce this sort of content we're all talking about online. I think it really underlines it.
Can I just ask you one slightly different question? The Speaker, as I'm sure you know, John Barker, was overheard this week calling your colleague Andrea Leadsom a stupid woman. He hasn't denied those comments. Do you think he needs to consider his position as Speaker?
Well, Andrea does a great job as Leader of the House. She is the absolute opposite of a stupid woman. There's no way to talk about colleagues, really, in the workplace.
Is it acceptable to have a Speaker who refers to the Leader of the House that way?
Well, no, it's not. Although I do think we need to, take stock and deliberate over whether it has to be part of a wider picture, doesn't it, really? I mean, it's unacceptable what he is alleged to have said, but, it's that on its own is not a reason for him to suddenly, lose his job.
Okay.
In my view.
All right.
But that doesn't detract from the fact that that is an appalling thing to say about a colleague.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. And viewers in the West Midlands can hear more from Margot James later on in this programme.